Today I've got Dr Andrew Germann with us. He's part of our congregation, and about time I introduced you.
Thanks.
Yeah, just sitting there like a random.
Okay.
And I've asked, I want to interview him today because we've got there's two referendums that we're voting on in this election. And I was having a chat with someone in our congregation who's doing some good research around these two referendums. And I just was like, well done, mate, for doing that. And he said, and his exact words were something along the lines of, they weren't exact, his words were, these are too big, they're too big not to engage with deeply and properly. And so it's really important that we look at these. Now, we aren't going to be talking from the front around the cannabis referendum, but I'm going to fire out an email not this week, I'm going to be on holiday this week, next week. So please don't vote. Don't do early voting before you've read the stuff they say. You're not allowed to vote this week, but the following week you can after you've read the email. And so I'm just going to send out some resources just to help you make an informed decision there. But we're not going to go there within a public talk like this. But we are going to talk about the end of life referendum today, which ties in with last week's talk around the sanctity of life. And the reason partly that I want to do this far more publicly is because the referendum for the cannabis one is different in the sense that then there's a whole process that's going to happen around the outcome of that referendum, around select committees and around public submissions and all that sort of stuff. The difference with the end of life bill is that all of that has been done, and this is the final thing. And the exact words are actually that if you support, you choose yes, I support, or no, I don't support the End of Life Choice Act 2019 coming into force. So coming into force means that the Act would start operating as law in New Zealand. So it's a far bigger decision, and it's a far more important vote in terms of where the process is at. And so I've invited Andrew Germann, and I'm going to have a chat with him. Now, Andrew Germann has a lot of letters next to his name. Bachelor of Medicine and a Bachelor of Surgery, a Diploma in Child Health, and he's a Fellow of the Australasian College of Emergency Medicine. How many years have you studied, do you reckon, total?
Since probably total 16, I think.
16 years of study.
Yeah. So after school, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Which I reckon you got ripped off because it says a Bachelor of Medicine and a Bachelor of Surgery. I've got a Bachelor of Ministry and I studied I stayed for 3 years. You got 16 years. Slight probably income difference is true. But we're both dealing with lives. Come on, yeah. Tweet that. He's the emergency medicine consultant at the Hawke's Bay Hospital, which means you're the top doctor?
No. I'm one of the emergency medicine consultants, so there's...
But a consultant, because for the average Joe, so you've got your doctor and then consultant, is that right?
Senior medical officer.
So it's like Gold Elite for New Zealand. Right? Yeah.
If you want, yeah.
Okay. He's also the emergency doctor COVID-19 lead, so he's overseeing that for the emergency department and the emergency department ultrasound lead. He was the Christian Medical Fellowship representative to the Care Alliance from 2015 to 2017. He's presented the submission on behalf of the Christian Medical Fellowship to the Health Select Committee for the petition of the petition for the sorry, you don't explain that.
That was the earlier petition.
This is why I'm a pastor. You're a doctor, because I can't even read properly.
The petition to the Health Select Committee, which was a few years ago. So that was before it went to the Justice Committee. It was the Health Select Committee. Right. So I presented that one on behalf of the Christian Medical Fellowship for New Zealand.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to dive into this. Have we got that outside? I think we've got the speaker working out there. So the referendum coming up is a big one. I want to say this on some opening comments, and then I'm going to ask Andrew a couple of questions. If anyone's watched someone they love die, particularly die in a way that where there was suffering, then this is especially poignant for you, And I just want to say just grace and peace, because that's a horrible thing to have to go through. And in the Western world, we're shielded from seeing that much death. I'm in a profession where I probably see it a little bit more. This guy's in a profession where he sees it all the time. But watching someone you love die is just not a pleasant thing at all, at best case scenario. And so I know that this issue is raw for people, and so I just want to acknowledge that up front, that this is, and secondly, it's been a brutal year. I would love it if we're just talking about God's mercy and love every Sunday. I feel like that's, and we're actually going to finish the year just talking about God's mercy and love. But there's just kind of like the perfect storm of these really serious referendum taking place that we just have to take seriously and we have to engage with. And I hope the last couple of weeks have been helpful around, my heart just to serve us as followers of Jesus to navigate these waters. And so I'm sorry that it has been such heavy going for a while. This is a really big decision, and those opposed to this legislation include Hospice New Zealand, the Australian and New Zealand Society for Geriatric Medicine, the New Zealand Medical Association, Palliative Care Nurses for New Zealand, the Christian Medical Fellowship. There's been 1,750 New Zealand doctors that have written an open letter saying around the banner "Doctors Say No." This is there's a reason why this is the case. And so Andrew's done a lot of work looking at the Act. I think you've brought it with you, didn't you? Or,
yeah,
you
but
don't need it.
I don't know, it's in my bag. We'll see how we go with that.
So he's engaged pretty seriously with it. And in my conversations with him, it's been incredibly helpful. And like I said 2 Sundays ago, I think it's important for us as followers of Jesus to wisely work out what are the voices that we choose to come under in terms of authoritative voices, whether that's theological, whether that's scientific, whether that's medical, whether that's dental, I don't care. It's important that you make those decisions because we're all choosing to have our worldview shaped. And so Andrew's been one of these guys that's been helpful for me personally around how seriously should we take the COVID-19 pandemic? And if you've got questions around that, I would suggest you have a chat with him after the service, but also around this referendum. So Andrew, tell us exactly what we are voting for in this upcoming referendum.
Yeah, so first of all, I just want to say these are my personal views, so they're not the views of the District Health Board or the Emergency Department, just as a disclaimer. But so in terms of what we are voting for, so the main big difference, as you mentioned, is the End of Life Choice Act is actually an act that's already been passed by Parliament, and it's just conditional on if there's more than 50% votes for the referendum saying, yes, I want it to go into force, then it will go into force a year after the election. So it's not a referendum on do we in principle support end of life choice at the end of life. It's about do you support this particular piece of legislation, which is what's very difficult about, because it means every single New Zealander voting has to therefore think about the entirety of the Act in its whole as it is. It's a long document, and it has, and we have to be able to think about, are there sufficient protections? What is it offering? Who's going to access it? And do we actually want this? Essentially, we need to be almost like lawyers or politicians and doctors all in one, trying to decide, yes, we think this is something we want, or no, this is something we don't want. So I think even that, I don't even think that information is all that well known, but it's certainly very significant for this piece of legislation. So in terms of what it is, I'll just run through what it actually says. So, I guess there's the process that's gone to create it, and then
why
there's
don't you
what
speak
it
to that,
is.
because that's pretty disappointing around probably how our government has gone about getting to this point, right?
Yeah. So there's been a whole lot of history about people like trying to bring euthanasia in the past, which I won't go into. But in terms of this particular piece of legislation, so it was brought to the Justice Select Committee, who then looked into it, and it was actually the most engaged in ever select committee for the country. So they had around 39,000 submissions, which is a lot more engaged than New Zealanders generally are with politics. Of those submissions, 92% were opposed to going ahead with it. 8% were either for or neutral. And so it was a huge number of submissions, and they went around. They went around the whole country hearing submissions. Of those submissions, 20 medical organisations or nursing or healthcare related submitted, none of which were for the legislation. Some of them were neutral, most of them were against. The overwhelming from disability sector was against. overwhelming from, I think there were 111, or more than that actually, religious organisations, none of which supported it either. So a whole lot of organisations against it, a whole lot of individuals against it in the submission process. So it was a huge process. It did have, on the actual committee, there were people who were for or against euthanasia even before the whole process started, which is probably representative of the New Zealand population. So it made it a very difficult process with the committee. So they then had to weigh up the evidence, but then they have to decide on their recommendations. And what they actually found with this was their recommendations, essentially it was very hard for them to make agreement on any major recommendations. So the recommendations they came up with were minor technical recommendations, essentially just on some of the wording about how to make it slightly more robust. But they weren't able to reach agreement between them on any major recommendations. So they sent it back to Parliament for the third stage in Parliament to essentially decide on if there need to be any major changes or not. But it was essentially, we can't reach agreement. Even though we know that the submissions are against, we're going to just send it back to Parliament. So then that's what happened through the Select Committee. Then it came to Parliament, and that's where it became even more tricky because Parliament, again, is divided, and there's so much division about this issue, which makes it so complex and complicated. But so Parliament, the Select Committee said we do think it needs to be a conscience vote in Parliament as one of their recommendations. We then had a bit of politicking take place where the Greens agreed to support it if there was removing the criteria for someone with chronic illness and leaving it only with someone with less than like a 6-month terminal diagnosis. So that was removed, and that meant that all of the Green Party then supported it. So they weren't voting then on conscience, it was a party policy. And then the New Zealand First said they were going to say no, and then they said we will support it if we put it to a referendum. So that's how we've ended up with a referendum on a whole piece of completed legislation, which is something which hasn't happened before. Which essentially is saying it's too political for the politicians even to make calls on. Just give it back to the New Zealand public, which is, I mean, one of the interesting things was one of the MPs who was for the legislation, Louisa Moore, actually voted against it when it came to that final third stage because of the division that it is causing and would cause with it being a referendum to the New Zealand public. And it's not good for anyone, for us all to have to be deciding on a piece of legislation which is extremely complex with a simple question being, do you support the Act coming into force in the election?
Yeah, which means that to vote, with some sense of knowing what the heck you're voting for, you have to have engaged with what the Act is saying because there isn't wiggle room anymore. It's like this is actually coming into law. Yeah,
there's zero room for any changes. It's either going to come into law in a year's time after election or it won't.
So what's in the Act then?
So just the basics of it. So the basic criteria is that if you go to your doctor and you say, I want to request assisted suicide, then you have to meet certain criteria. So that's that you have to have a terminal illness that is expected with a prognosis of less than 6 months to live, unbearable suffering related to that illness, advanced state of physical decline, and then you have to express in writing that you want to go ahead with assisted suicide or euthanasia, and then there's a stipulation that you can't have purely be requesting it based on mental illness, being of advanced age or having a disability, but that doesn't exclude you from having it. So if you fit any of those categories and you get a terminal diagnosis, then you are entitled to euthanasia. So you can't do it just for those reasons, but it also doesn't prevent you, and there aren't many provisions to actually make sure there's not an interaction between those two. So,
and so the first one around that 6 months to live, like in your doctor world, is that, how accurate would that be? Like, is there some concern around getting that wrong?
Yes, so, I mean, it's definitely going to be very tricky to decide that someone has 6 months to live. I'm not sure. I mean, even basic medical knowledge, if you don't go to your doctor and expect them to be able to say, you're going to die, on this date, or even within the closest month. It's much more variable than that. So I think around diagnosis, there's maybe a 10% error rate. That's just even confirming you have the right diagnosis. And then prognosis, like how you're going to go with it, is around 20% of the time they'll get it right when it's that far out. So, and that might be that you actually have a worse prognosis or a better prognosis. So, but it just, particularly when you're at the several months time frame, it's inaccurate. Even, I mean, I can only really speak from emergency point of view. Even someone comes in and looking very unwell and we suspect they could be close to death. We sometimes don't know between hours, days, or even weeks when we're looking at someone and talking to them and their family. So it's when it gets extrapolated out from there, it becomes much, much more difficult.
And one of the concerns hearing that would be like how susceptible to this act being abused or vulnerable people who maybe feeling pressure from their family or that side of things. Like, do you have any thoughts around that side of things? Yeah,
so in terms of the actual process, so if you're requesting assisted suicide or euthanasia, so you ask your doctor. The Act specifically says that the doctor then has a process they have to go through. So they have to tell you, first of all, that death is permanent and that you will die, which is important to know. You have to, but then what was I saying? That they need to encourage you to talk to any family members that you may want to talk to. But then they also need to tell you that you do not need to talk to any family members or anyone else about it. Which does become very difficult. So, and then the medical practitioner can talk to your usual medical practitioner if the one you've gone to is not your usual medical practitioner. So the only person that the doctor's actually allowed to talk to if a person does not want them to talk to anyone is the usual medical practitioner. And that's about the extent there is of being able to really, if someone is requesting it and refusing to have anyone talk to anyone else about it, talk to family, that's the only person that medical practitioner can talk to. So it essentially becomes like, does your GP know whether you're being coerced to request this? Which, I mean, I don't think many GPs would be in that position to know that. So it's the risk of coercion is something that most of us doctors are very worried about. I think the Act's been designed, for people who it's almost like a best case scenario where someone wants to engage with their family and talk about it, and they, maybe they're, someone who is able to not have coercion or financial stress or difficult access to services, who's, has their full powers, gets a terminal diagnosis, and then is wanting to then talk to the medical practitioner and think about it. That's almost how it's been designed, but I think my concerns is just the fact that not everyone fits into that category, and there are going to be people who do have they don't have true choice, and that they may not have access to the oncology services they need or the palliative care services they need. I mean, in Hawke's Bay, if you want radiotherapy, we'd need to go to Palmerston North to get it. So it's, there's just little things like that, which is difficult there is definitely a risk of coercion with it.
And it puts doctors in a very full-on position where they're having to make decisions that are really heavy. And I know that you guys have to I know you're an ED doctor, so like making those heavy, big decisions is part of your gig, but this seems to be another level in terms of, making a choice that someone is going to end their life. And surely this violates the Hippocratic Oath. Is it the Hippocratic? Is it like hypocrisy? The hypocritical? Isn't that like there's got to be some sort of violation in terms of like that side of things?
Yeah, so it does, but I wouldn't say that's the strongest argument for why I'm worried about it. The Hippocratic Oath, also says to worship Apollo and.
So you're saying we don't live in ancient Greece anymore?
Pay your tutor any financial needs that they have and that sort of thing, which, so I think we have moved on from that. But it is something.
Another example of that, why you're the doctor and I'm the pastor.
Yeah, no,
but
but
what about this ancient Greece little oath that there was from back in the day?
But I mean, we do need to practice ethically, and and even just talking about the competence side of things in the Act. So there's in terms of so I was just trying to think about. There was a point you made about doctors making life and death decisions. So we do make life and death decisions, which ideally we do want to be giving people their full autonomy, explaining options, and that is how we operate. And if there's any decisions that are equal benefit to a patient, then we do want to offer this is an option, and especially with palliative care, we're aiming to neither prolong life or hasten death kind of thing. So it is trying to give people the autonomy to make those decisions at all times. But the difficulty with doctors being involved and then assisting with a person's death is that often we're making decisions where the outcome is we're looking to help a patient. So it might be deciding between a treatment which may have some life prolonging benefit versus but still be difficult, say chemotherapy, versus not doing it where you may live less duration, but may be a decision you want to make, but which is I think is fine when it's both are options that potentially are beneficial to the patient. What's very difficult is when you have to try and decide something where the person will die, and it is putting that on an equal option with in a medical consultation is a very difficult way to practice it. So.
You've mentioned the word palliative care a few times. For numpties like me, do you want to explain what palliative care actually means?
Palliative care is the practice of the speciality of medicine where people are looking after people who are dying. So in New Zealand, it's generally defined as around if you have there's the surprise test is kind of the general way people think about it. So would you be surprised if this person were to die within the next 12 months is kind of an idea of when you might be appropriate for palliative care. In terms of what it offers, so it's generally it's all about quality of life and a holistic approach to looking after people when they are dying. So part of that is definitely pain relief medication, but part of it is also looking at all the existential issues which come in, and anyone receiving a terminal diagnosis is a major life event, clearly, and it is going to be distressing. People are going to have ups and downs. They're going to grieve the process and what's going on. They're going to have good days and bad days, and palliative care it's essentially the doctors and nurses who have really devoted themselves to looking after people in that really difficult time. So I mean, we do it. We have a little bit of palliative care in emergency, but it's certainly not the ideal place for it. But I definitely respect all the doctors and nurses that do commit to that, and they generally will be working through with a whole lot of issues with people at that time.
Because I think for a lot of people that would be looking at voting yes, a big part of the motivation would be to see someone they love not suffer when they die, which is more of a palliative care issue, is that correct, rather than like a euthanasia issue. It's actually more... So do you want to explain kind of what's different between assisted dying, which is what they're talking about here, and kind of what would happen today in an ideal situation, and maybe unpack a little bit around access to palliative care or how that kind of looks for folks?
Yeah, so I guess one thing to really make clear is that the process at the moment is we encourage people to think about if they do not resuscitate order. So that's saying if something were to happen, I wouldn't want CPR, I wouldn't want a breathing tube if you're in an advanced state of an illness. And so we definitely are respecting that and actually encouraging people to think about that. The other thing is we won't be practicing futile medicine. So if someone comes in and it's futile, especially in New Zealand, I think doctors are very good at recognising that, so it's not treatment. We don't treat at all costs, and it's so that sort of process is already in place. Well, yeah, I'm trying to think of the rest of the question.
Like, in terms of palliative care, like someone I love is dying and I don't want to see them suffer as they die. What is that, like, what are my options and what sort of conversations can I have to help minimise or really get that as low as possible?
So, I mean, this sort of thing I think needs a whole team of people. I mean, the first thing is going to be, talking with GP and family and working through things. But in terms of what palliative care can do is providing medication in the home. So often people, I think, are worried with euthanasia about one of the big things people think about is, will I have intolerable pain? Is something that people definitely worry about, which, I mean, certainly I've never seen someone dying in immense pain because if I'm right there, we're able to give medicine to treat. I think access to palliative care is an issue in some areas, but in terms of that, like a good palliative care service can, and like general practices, they can go have nurses come into the house every day, giving medicine and setting up even a syringe driver to just have a continuous infusion under the skin that just gives a baseline level of pain relief, where the aim really is that people shouldn't be suffering in pain. And saying that, you can never say never, so there's always going to be, you can't say that no person is going to die, that no one is ever going to die without pain. People will potentially have some pain in a palliative situation, but the pain which really gets people is when it's unceasing, unrelenting, unchanging pain that isn't treated. And part of palliative care is really taking the edge off that and getting people into a place where they're comfortable.
I mean, it's no secret that, and you'd know firsthand that the health system's pretty broken, been underfunded for way too long, and everyone's stretched in your world. Just speaking from my own personal experience, I know my mum, who was a nurse, was very bossy when elderly members of our family were dying around, hey, you've got to, like, this isn't, you've got to sort this out. So people have that option, of like going, this person's dying, they're in pain right now, can you guys do something?
Yes, and I mean, that's partly what hospice is there for. So if things aren't manageable at home, then there's hospice is an inpatient unit essentially where the dedicated team is looking after all those palliative needs, and there will be palliative care doctors looking at the medication side of things and the holistic side of things, the family discussions. There's also going to be like physiotherapists, occupational therapists looking at everything they can to help that person maximise quality of life in whatever way they can.
Yeah.
So,
I read Dr. Sean Dutoy, who's a Bible doctor, not a medical doctor, but he said, surely we can find more creative ways of responding to suffering than ending people's lives. And I thought that was a really good statement around this particular act. Do you want to just kind of, back to the act, do you want to just speak to, I know you've spoken to a couple, but the major issues for you around this act in terms of what's making you pretty nervous about the whole thing?
Yeah, so I mean, to be honest, it's really the people, the vulnerable people who could get caught up in this act, which I'm worried about. So, yeah, I mean, we live in a secular society. I think if people do want to decide that they want euthanasia, that it works, and that's what this act is designed to help them get, then that is, it's not up to us as Christians to be judging or doing anything about that. But I am more concerned about the people who will be caught out, maybe because they do feel, at their advanced age, they feel like a burden on their family, they feel like a burden on the health system. There are so many different potential reasons why people may feel either, whether it's implicit or explicit coercion, so whether it's someone specifically saying, you may as well be gone, life's not worth living, or them, a person just thinking, I'm old, I'm dying, I may as well not be here, I'm depressed, just get on with it. It's sad, but I think there will be people who almost feel like instead of it being a right to die, it's their duty to die.
Right.
And just by the fact that it's been there, the thing is, this law will catch a huge number of people. I mean, we all die at some point. And
I'm not a
often
doctor, but 100%. That's sort of my understanding. Yeah.
So we will all, like most people will need to think about it. There are situations where you won't qualify, but majority, I think, of people will at some point if it comes into force, need to think about it, and that it's a heavy burden to start thinking, is it my time to say I need to...
Yeah. I heard a story about, in Canada, correct me if I'm wrong, this law is in effect, is that right? Yeah. And I heard a story about a woman, I've got some friends and pastors over there, a woman who discovered she had cancer, and then she was nervous about how honest she could be with her doctor because she didn't know how pro-euthanasia the doctor she was dealing with was. And so that put her in this horrible situation where she was starting to second guess the motives of the doctors that were meant to be treating her in terms of, the chemotherapy and all the rest of it. Which, and secondly, from what I've seen, and you'd know far more than me, but the initial act that goes through isn't the last evolution of that act. From what I can see in Europe and other places, that the limitations get broader and broader around this as the years go by. Would that be correct?
Yeah. So people. Yeah, people on for or against the euthanasia will debate this, but it's I think the potential for scope creep, so it increasing in what effectively happens, is definitely there, and I think there's two sides to that. One is the obvious one is if there's a law change, so if people decide we're going to change the law, which has happened in some jurisdictions. The other potential is just that the practical scope creep, where people essentially are socialised to the idea of euthanasia as normal, and then deciding, the application of it becomes just that little bit more liberal in terms of how people practice it. Which, when you look at the numbers of different countries each year, once it's introduced, gradually they do increase. It's usually around about, I think, 25% per year. So the numbers start low, but then they just will slowly pick up. And if you're for euthanasia, you could argue that that's people accepting it and engaging with it and it's working. Or if you're against euthanasia, you could be saying this is actually just the scope is creeping. And I think it's inevitable that there is going to be an increase in the people accessing it. But the other side, the legislative side, is once you've created a right to euthanasia, then it's almost that people can challenge it and say it's discriminatory not to allow a certain person to access it. So I think when it became legal in Canada, it was like 10 days afterwards, there was a challenge that it was discriminating against a certain group of people because it is, because you're saying, we're deciding. It's extremely arbitrary to say you have 6 months. A doctor is essentially best guessing that you have 6 months to live and therefore you can access it. Whereas if their best guess was you had 7 months to live, you couldn't access it. It's, and a lot of the criteria is just based around things where people are, or people get worried about their physical decline or not being able to continue their activities, and which does tie in a lot with the disability side of things, and that essentially it's almost. A lot of the criteria in legislation often becomes like an ableist kind of viewpoint, where it's saying if you can't, wipe your bum or do your usual activities, then you should qualify for it. But at the same time, there are many people who are living with long-term disabilities who have great quality of life, who love their life, and it's trying to define it on these criteria just becomes very tricky, and it is. It kind of is discrimination. And in New Zealand, they took it with the select committee to the Attorney General to decide if it was compatible with the New Zealand Bill of Rights. And the Attorney General said that it is, except for the age criteria, where their only recommendation was that the age, instead of being 18 being the cutoff, should be 16 to be consistent with the fact that you can do so many, make independent health decisions when you're 16. So, which I don't think anyone's necessarily proposing in New Zealand, but it just shows that legally it is inconsistent with if we're saying that you have a right to die it's inconsistent with the Bill of Rights not to make it 16.
And also, I suppose, from a Christian worldview, and hopefully not just from a Christian worldview, when we've got such a full-on teen suicide issue in New Zealand anyway, there is a sense where this sends a broader message to society that, if it gets too tricky, you can call it a day, which seems to me a bit of a mixed message around, what we're trying to do there. And it's also, I think we should be rightly pretty annoyed that a whole lot of experts, 92%, said no, and the government and that select committee couldn't have the guts to actually go with that, and then made it a political hot potato, and now we're in this position now where there's all sorts of issues around it. And while I'm on the subject, the last thing that really bugs me is that from what I can see and everything you've said, this is not about whether someone should suffer at the end of their life, because that isn't an end-of-life bill situation. That's a palliative care situation. And from what I've read, the palliative care guys are saying we've been under-resourced, we would like more resource, which would deal with the issue, that everyone's probably emotively would vote, yes, I'm supportive of this because of the suffering thing. But if we take that off the table because palliative care's been well-resourced, then, it changes the whole situation, doesn't it?
Yeah, and so that's for that. Hospice in New Zealand, it's 50% government funded and 50% donations. So it's like every other specialty. I can only think of that in ambulance that seem to be relying on charitable donations to actually even do their daily activities. So we really haven't resourced it sufficiently, and yet we're still introducing this. And like as you mentioned, the suicide point. New Zealand. It's the highest youth suicide in the OECD. It's a mental health crisis at the moment. We actually, in emergency, we deal far more with mental health issues than with, and suicide attempts than we do with palliative care. And it's just, it's heartbreaking to think, what are we going to be saying to people? If someone has a mental health condition and then they develop a diagnosis where the doctor guesses that they are 6 months life expectancy or less, the actual legislation then says pretty much they are entitled to euthanasia, and there's no provision that any actual treatment needs to be done to address their mental health, to address that they've had adequate palliative care, to address their pain control is adequate. There's no provisions in the Act for that. You'd hope that would happen, and that doctors are caring and are unlikely to be complicit in just jumping into that. But at the same time, in terms of a patient's rights point of view, if that's what they're requesting, then that is what they are entitled to under the Act. So there's not a huge amount of leg to stand on. And there is a provision in the Act for a psychiatrist review, but the actual reasons when that comes into play is, so just the basics of the requesting it, there's two practitioners need to decide that and sign off that they think it should go ahead. So there's the initial medical practitioner, and then they need to refer to the if the patient's requesting it, they need to refer to the SCENS group, which is a body that then essentially finds another practitioner that had said that they're for euthanasia, happy to go ahead with that, an independent one to then sign off. And if the two of them sign off and say the patient, it's consistent that they can have euthanasia, then that goes ahead. But if either of them have concern about the patient's competency, then they refer them to a psychiatrist. So there is the provision to refer to a psychiatrist, but the basis for that isn't based on are they depressed. It's based on are they competent, where the actual criteria that are defined for competency in the Act, they've said it's a very low level, basic level of competence. So you need to be able to understand what euthanasia is and that you have a terminal illness, be able to think about it enough and rearrange your mind and then express that you understand what it is. And that's, I'm getting there's 4 different steps. It's just like they need to be able to think about it, understand it, work with the information in their head and then re-express it to the doctor. So essentially, if you can understand that you've got a terminal illness and you want to request euthanasia, that's the level of competence that's required. So it's not any further level of that you actually there's no mental health assessment, there's no further understanding of it. And that's the reason, if they're worried about that, they can refer to the psychiatrist.
So Andrew, is there a case where somebody could make a decision now before they got to that 6 months?
So the question was, can you make a decision before you get to the 6 months? So they've specifically said in this Act that you can't do it based on an advanced care directive. So an advanced care directive is where you say, this is what's happening now as advanced care directives, where people say, if I need to go to hospital for whatever reason and I'm sick, I don't want resuscitation. That's probably the basis, but you can also specify a whole lot of other things on an advanced care directive. So I would encourage anyone who's unwell with chronic illness to think about an advanced care directive if you're worried that you may be in a place where you're incapacitated and can't express your wishes. But this Act specifically says against that, yeah. I mean, my main thoughts are that I would suggest that everyone really read up on it. The basics would be just read, maybe it's too much.
Actually on the screen, Grant, you bring those up. We've got a bunch that you sent through that are options, and we'll email this out.
The basics for me is actually read the legislation, because you're essentially being asked to be a legislator in the election. So it's detailed and it's complex, but it's worth it doesn't take that long to read through it. So I would recommend that people it's just on the Parliament website, so you can just Google it and look through just to know what it actually is. There's a few other resources there. So there's a book. That book is by a journalist who just during the COVID lockdown realised she had a lot of time on her hands and went around and just asked all the key players in New Zealand and does a chapter on each of them, just interviewing them about their thoughts on it. So that's a really informative book. Risky Law is a website essentially just dedicated to the specific Act and what the concerns are with it. So there's plenty of resources there. And there's a few other resources there as well that can be looked into. So,
A couple of closing thoughts. If this, we'll stick this out on YouTube or whatever, if you want to send this to your friends, use whatever platform you've got, I think, just to spread the word so people know what we're voting for. On this one, it's a huge decision. A couple of closing thoughts from my angle as a pastor, not as a doctor. As we've said, you are going to die. Be encouraged. But I tell you what, hallelujah. The more that we can actually get our heads around that, the better. And as followers of Jesus, making friends with the idea that one day you're going to die is really important. Because as a pastor, and I know we've had this conversation, and if I can speak on behalf of Andrew here, as a doctor, the most difficult people to work with and journey alongside as they die are those that are in denial about the fact they're dying. The earlier that you can accept that one day you're going to die means that when you do get that news, you'll be able to journey far more gracefully, and it will be far more easy on your family. And I'm going to finish with this in a second, and actually will result in your death being a blessing. The other thing is that we want to push back against the lie that says just because you're getting older means that you have no value in our society. Like, there is a humbling that takes place as you get older, because particularly, guys will struggle, but I think everyone will struggle. You move from being the person helping to the person needing some help. And that's humbling. But as followers of Jesus, we want to walk in humility and actually let people serve us. It's a joy to be able to serve those that are elderly and that need some support. And my mother in particular has modeled this beautifully. As followers of Jesus, we want to look after our elderly family and friends, and to visit and to care and to love and to support. And in fact, there's so much wisdom we're missing out on for those that have journeyed through all sorts of things in life. And so can I encourage you to just begin thinking about the fact that you're going to die? And I finished with this. Ronald Rolheiser's written an amazing book called Sacred Fire. I'd recommend everyone reads it. And he talks about the 3 stages in our life. The first stage is getting your life together. Now, sadly, this is taking longer and longer and longer for a lot of people because they haven't been parented very well. So we've got a whole lot of ABs, adult babies, who still don't know how to budget or who still don't know, haven't dealt with the trauma from their past or haven't, whatever, okay? But you've got to get your life together at some point. The second and hopefully the longest phase of your life is giving your life away so that you are a blessing to others. This is the Christian way. Learning to die to yourself and be a blessing to the world around you. And then the third act of our life, he would contend, is learning to give our deaths away. Giving our death away. And he says this, as Christians, we believe that Jesus lived for us and that he died for us, that he gave us both his life and his death. What we often fail to distinguish in this, however, is that there are two clear and separate movements here. Jesus gave his life for us in one movement, and he gave his death for us in another movement. In essence, he gave his life for us through his activity and his generous actions for us, and he gave his death through his passivity, through absorbing in love the helplessness, humiliations, and ultimate loneliness of dying. Like Jesus, we too are meant to give our lives away in generosity and selflessness, but we're also meant to give our deaths away, not just at the moment of our death, but in the whole process of leaving this planet in such a way that our diminishment and death is our final and perhaps greatest gift to the world. If we die well, without bitterness and without regret, the spirit we leave behind will be one that is nurturing, warm, and cleansing. Now, I want to die well. And I'm only 40, halfway through, hopefully, what my allotted days are. But it's like already I think it's important, even at this age and wherever age you're at, to think about that. I want to die without bitterness. I want to die in such a way that I'm not in denial and making things tricky for my family. I want to die in such a way that they can love me and serve me and care for me. And I want to die in such a way that leaves a blessing over my family. And probably the greatest blessing, those closest to me that have died, particularly my godly grandfather, his death was the greatest blessing. It was a place of incredible, it was like literally heaven on earth in that room with him. And it was just a joy to be with him in that time. And he was helpless, and it was lonely, and there wasn't dignity, and it is humiliating and all of that. But we can die in such a way that's a blessing. And so that's the Christian worldview that we want to have. So there's, as we talked through things like last week, there's the Christian ethic, which is we value life every step of the way. There is the pastoral care. How can we love those who are going through this? There's the public policy that we need to engage in. And then there's the kingdom vision. And the kingdom vision is that we would love and serve our elderly, and that they would be treasured and valued. And whether they're in our family or not, we've got a big job to do, church. And secondly, that we would die in such a way that we would be a great blessing. Amen? Let's give Andrew a big hand and thank you for his wisdom in there.